start, I thought I would start with Michael Moore. So he is the first herbalist that I studied with intensively. I went and traveled out to Arizona, down near a town called Bisbee. So it's right by the Mexican border. And it was high desert. It was kind of amazing landscape with amazing traditions there. This was the land of the Apache Indian nations. This was, there was very rich curanderismo cultures that were there. Michael himself was originally from California, and he didn't like to fly. So he spent his whole life tootling around in his van in these Western states, and he loved plants. And he was really, really wonderful with them. And so he was the first person that I studied with. And so that's why I figured I would start this evening's lectures with. Michael has passed away now a few years ago, and he first started teaching. So he was one of the, a very old herb school for the United States. And I think probably started in the early 80s or late 70s with his herb school. It was originally in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then ended up in Bisbee when I studied with him. And here he is. So this picture before, this is him with the arnica. This is arnica, if y'all have heard of that. Arnica, there's Arnica montana, which is from Europe, and this is most likely Arnica cordifolia, or one of the other species that we were looking at there. And this was in Colorado. We were on a field trip. But here he is in the classroom, and look at all those lovely little jars of herbs behind him there. And yes, his beard has gotten a little green because he used to bob around in his pool as part of his physical therapy. And I guess they had maybe the chlorine off one day. He came in with the green beard. It's pretty cute. But he wrote a lot about something called Constitutional Physiology. So, Michael, and this, I've put this picture up here because this you can get online at his website. This is an incredible read. It's only about 30 pages long, this document. It's called Principles and Practice of Constitutional Physiology for Herbalists. And basically what Michael explains in here is that he really thinks it's important that we do an energetic approach to medicine, that we really look at people as themselves. Like, what is your pattern of function as a person? How do you experience life? Are you hot? Are you dry? Are you wet? Are you, what are you like? And then once we understand that, we can use herbal medicine to create tonics to support the person. So therefore, they're able for their own bodies to better deal with whatever ailments might be affecting them. And this is a concept that we will see come up again and again in all these different cultures as we start studying them. But it's something that's not addressed as often in kind of Western conventional medicine. But Michael, as he says in the introduction to this little book here, this Principles and Practice, is that he comes from a Western culture. And so he wanted to understand herbalism and understand these energetic approaches through physiology, because that's his language. He grew up learning about livers and learning about, the digestive tract, and learning about how blood circulates, and learning about different things in the blood and different chemicals and, different neurotransmitters. And so this is how he, wanted to approach his work with herbal medicine. And so he really got into this idea of looking at people's basic constitution and really looking at how that manifests in people and helping to identify different patterns. We do have a class a little bit later in the year called Different Strokes for Different Folks. And I think we're going to dive into some of these concepts a little bit more. But what he was coming out of was this kind of Western tradition here. And this is also known as medical herbalism. And sometimes it's also referred to as phytotherapy, phyto being the word for plant. So plant therapy. So this is, it expands beyond this, but I'm going to say it's kind of a Euro-Anglo, meaning UK, England, American tradition of herbal practice. And so it's usually considered clinic-based. And what we'll do is we'll create herbal preparations to both treat disease or pathology or ailments in people. And also, though, we will use those same preparations to promote health, to promote, well-being, as I've written here, to help people feel their strongest and their most vital, so they don't get sick as often. Medical herbalists will train in courses very similar to medical doctors. So their courses will be things like anatomy, physiology, pharmacognosy, pathologies, right? So studying diseases and how that manifests in the body, herb-drug interaction, etc. There's a really strong focus on strengthening and supporting the body's vitality and own natural ability to heal itself. So I'm going to make a little example about Michael again. He used to say that, you know, we've got all these different organ systems functioning in our body, and he would compare it. He liked food. So he would say, this is a little bit like you've got this stack of pancakes. And let's say you've got this, you know, one organ system, which is one of the pancakes, maybe your liver, your hepatic system, that it is a little bit under functioning. It's a little bit deficient. So what happens is, in order that the whole stack of pancakes doesn't fall over because one's hanging out a little this way, the other ones will kind of shift a little in the other direction as they try to balance everything out. Now, that's compensation, right? And so one of the approaches a medical herbalist might take is like, wait, let's identify what the weak link is here. Let's identify that deficient pancake. Let's strengthen that pancake so it kind of moves back in line. Then your other parts of your body aren't having to compensate so much, and they can kind of move back in line as well. And that keeps the stack of pancakes all strong. So this is that concept that if we can support the body's deficiencies, support the body's vitality, it can help take care of itself. It can help bring itself back into alignment. Medical herbalists recognize that no two patients are alike, and so they tend to create customized formulas. I work a lot that way myself. I like to blend things, you know, for the individual based on things that I identify when I am, you know, working with them. So if I notice that they run a little hot or run a little cold, or if I notice they have a certain kind of history, like some things in their health history that might indicate that they could benefit from certain supportive herbs, you know, we can throw them in there. There's also an emphasis on holistic care. So we're not just looking at what herbs we can give to somebody, you know, and we're not just looking at, you know, some physical problems they have. We're looking at the whole kind of shebang. We want to know, you know, what's going on with them physically, what's going on with them emotionally, and what's going on in their life, what's happening in their environment. You know, if somebody lives in a food desert and doesn't have access to healthy food on a regular basis, the things they're taking into their body maybe aren't really very supportive. The things that they're able to eat aren't really strengthening and supporting their body's vitality. It can be really hard to compensate for that by just, you know, giving a few herbal capsules or something, right? So we might also, as herbalists, also look at those lifestyle things that are happening and try to help problem solve that area. Like, can we find ways for them to get better food access as well? So this slide's called Western Lineage because I wanted to say that, you know, the modern phytotherapy that's being practiced, or medical herbalism, this has evolved out of a lineage, right? So there is deeper roots to all of this medicine. And it evolved out of humoral medicine. And humoral medicine is also the roots of what is conventional Western medicine now. So what the American Medical Association, you know, puts out as their type of medicine, that has evolved also out of humoral medicine. So humoral medicine was a theory that evolved in both Europe and Asia, parts of Persia, even back into ancient Egypt. Like that whole, it was probably a hotbed around the Mediterranean there, you know, Greece and Egypt and the Middle East and Turkey, and, you know, stretching out from there. But this theory has the idea that humans possess these different substances within them, and they're called humors. So if you were sick, it was because the humors were out of balance, right? There's 4 of them. And so maybe you had a couple of them that were deficient, or a couple of them that were excessive, or one of them that was deficient, or one that was excessive, whatever it was, this was the reason that you were ill. And this could be a mental illness or a physical illness. So what humoral medicine said was that you could bring balance back between all the humors using herbs and using diet. So different foods, different herbs could support different humors. And in that way, you would be brought back to health. So each of the humors of the 4 all possess different qualities. In the next slides we're going to go into, we're going to look a little bit at those different humors with their qualities. I put here in parentheses just a little note that this is a medicine that kind of evolved in the temperate zone of the world, because you'll notice in the next slide that each humor is related to a different season, and there's 4 of them, and there's 4 seasons. And so living in the temperate zones, that's where you would have that experience of a winter, of a spring, of a summer, of a fall. And so, this is something that I heard Christopher Headley talk about once, and I was like, yeah, that really makes a lot of sense. So here are the first 2. Isn't that a cool slide there? So the first 2, we've got black bile, we've got phlegm, and actually just really quickly, the other 2 are blood and yellow bile. So those are the 4 humors in the body. So like I said, each one is related to a season. So for black bile, it's autumn. It's also related to a substance. So we've got earth. And when I say earthy with the Y, I'm saying like, you could think of that as maybe an earthy person. Feces is, one of the human discharges that it's related to. And this is a cold and a dry humor. The kind of emotional qualities, this would be like the melancholic person. So that person is a bit despondent and a little bit quiet. We have the phlegm humor. And so this is associated with winter. And that's funny because you can see that, right? Like in the wintertime, we can get a little phlegmier, right? We can get that in our chest. This is associated with the water element. It's associated with mucus, of course, it's phlegm. And it's cold and wet. Again, wintertime, cold, wet, this, definitely jives. And this person is phlegmatic. They're relaxed and peaceful. So this is where you can kind of look again at that watery, right? Like think of what you would, if you were to envision like a watery person, that would be a relaxed, that would be a peaceful person. Next, we have blood. This is associated with the season of spring. This is an airy person, so very moving. Blood is I don't know why I keep saying like body fluid. I know body fluid is associated, and it's warm, it's moist, it's wet. And this is the sanguine person. So this person is optimistic. This person is social. Yellow bile is associated with summer. They're very fiery. It's associated with vomit. This is considered warm and dry of a humor. And this person is choleric. They're ambitious and they're restless. This is a little chart I think I got off Wiki. And this is where you can kind of see your different energetic, so hot and dry and cold and wet. And then it's been laid out on this nice chart where you can kind of see where these things come together. So with phlegm and water here, this is both wet and cold. With blood, which is airy, it's both hot and wet, and so on and so on. So that can be helpful to sometimes, you can look at things as lists when you're studying some of these archetypes, but it can be really helpful to then also see them in this kind of form. And I'd like to say that, the humoral tradition is something that it's not something that I really practice very much, but I've definitely read some different things and I've studied with a few different teachers for it. And it's definitely, there's pieces of it that I find that really jive and make a lot of sense. And then there's sometimes some pieces where they'll talk about, an herb and they'll say it's 4th degree hot and this and that. And I won't necessarily quite get it, but I still do think that the more you start to look at some of these energetic systems, the more you start to see some of these universal concepts, like for example, fire being warm and dry and associated with summer. I mean, that makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? And that person who is warm and fiery are ambitious and restless. Like you can see that and see those connections. And as you study other herbal traditions, you'll see those same associations happening over and over, where summer is associated with the element of fire, and that's associated with heat. So, and that's associated, with restlessness, especially when it's out of balance. When it's out of balance, that's experienced in that restless way. So the roots of this concept, right? These concepts of four humors, this stretches back to, like I said, this kind of Mediterranean area, but you've got Greece and Egypt and Mesopotamia and Asia and all of these ideas just moving around. And one of the first people to kind of write it down would be during the time of Hippocrates. And so what he did was he kind of took these ideas of these different elements and humors, and he kind of specifically applied it to medicine. So this was around 400 before the Common Era. And he's kind of attributed with having kind of created this four humoral system. And this became this Greek basis for modern medicine. So the American Medical Association, if they look back far enough down their lineage, they're going to go all the way back to Hippocrates here. The next person to have a kind of big impact on this system was the Roman physician Galen. He was around 200 CE, right? So about 600 years after Hippocrates. And he built on this foundation that Hippocrates had laid out. And then he added some different advances to that. He had different theories about the pneuma and about the vital spirit. And so there was definitely a big kind of renaissance of medicine at that time under Galen. And sometimes people refer to this as like Galenic medicine. So they take his name and turn it into an adjective there. Around 1000 CE in the Common Era, Ibn Sina, who is also known as Avicenna, he was a Persian polymath. He wrote something called the Canon of Medicine. And the Canon of Medicine was a massively important text. And it's something that, was still used in medical schools until the 1700s. And I put here, it's still an important text in what's known as Unani Tib medicine, which is the outgrowth from Avicenna's work. Unani Tib medicine is still practiced today. You'll find lots of practitioners all over the world, but I think there's maybe a bigger concentration in places like India, for example. Paul Bergner, who is an American herbalist, he has done some important facilitations of some of the translations of some of these texts and makes those available on his website, and still teaches some of these concepts. And actually, there's several practitioners these days who still do practice in a humoral system. And so they're definitely looking at the Canon of Medicine and looking at this Unani Tib medicine. So he was kind of great. He was an astronomer and a philosopher, not just a physician. He was a brilliant, brilliant man. So speaking of people today, those still utilizing and working with the humoral tradition. This is a picture I took of Christopher Headley at the Radical Herbalism gathering a few years ago. He has passed on. We do miss him, but he definitely practiced, working within this system. And he wrote a very, very easy to read article about the humors and working with that in clinical practice. And look how well I can spell the word section there. And so that's something that I'll definitely be sending out a direct link to in the resources. And it's also listed in the resources section, I believe, in the email that I sent y'all earlier. So he was a great lover of plants, and he's taken us all on a plant walk here, and he just has everybody enthralled. Like, the stories that he tells are just amazing. So you can always look for stuff from Christopher Headley. He has written a couple books as well. And then other practitioners who are influenced by this humoral medicine would be folks like Jim McDonald, who has a really great website called Herbcraft, Paul Bergner, who I mentioned earlier, and then Jill Stansbury. And Jill Stansbury, I believe, did some of the illustrations in Christopher Headley's article that he wrote for the AHG, and she's done some wonderful illustrative, really making those humors kind of make sense and illustrating it in a drawing. And so those can be really helpful. Sometimes seeing things drawn out in that form can help things sink in, that sometimes the words might not make it work. So there's some other people to look to if you're interested in learning more about humoral medicine. Obviously, if you are somebody who is used to practicing in a Western medical herbalism way, this would be your energetic roots. You know, this would be the way to kind of tap back into that source. So another person who practiced this type of medicine was Nicholas Culpeper. So I'm kind of taking y'all back a little bit again. It's apparently, you know, I you know, searched it out when I was in London. I was doing some of my foot studies in London. And so I was looking for like, where was his home? Where was his apothecary? Because Nicholas Culpeper I'm a major fan of Nicholas Culpeper. And so I finally found it. It's here. It's now, I guess, at hairdressers. But this was where he worked. And Nicholas Culpeper, you know, used the humoral system, but he was also a radical herbalist. I love him so much that I've named my still after him. This is Stella the Still Culpeper. There's my kitty cat, Chloe. And what Culpeper was all about was keeping herbs accessible. So he didn't like this idea that only physicians had the right to practice medicine. And because he lived in the London area, London in the early 1600s began to regulate medicine, which means herbal medicine, because back then that was the stuff of medicine. And so they said that only medicines could be made, because Culpeper was also an apothecary. You could only make medicines that were prescribed in this one particular book called the Pharmacopoeia Londinensis. Now, the problem with that book is that it was written in Latin, which meant if you didn't speak Latin or read and write Latin, you couldn't follow these recipes. So this was really shutting down medicine and only allowing the select few who were rich enough to afford schooling, or if you were part of the clergy. So, you know, this was a big problem. And also a problem with the pharmacopoeia was that it would have this recipe, but it wouldn't actually say what it was used for. So it really prevented people from being able to use it to kind of help themselves. So what he did was he decided to set up in Spitalfields, which is now in London, but at the time it was right outside the walls. So it wasn't technically London. So he was outside of the law's reach. And because he was the son of a clergyman, he was absolutely literate with Latin. He could read and write it perfectly. And so he translated it. He translated it into common English because he wanted people to be able to make these medicines and read about these medicines. And what he also did was he listed their uses alongside the recipes. So that meant that you could look for something that says, this is helpful for a toothache, and then you could make it. So I think he's pretty great. He's really keeping herbs in the hands of people. I'd like to take just a minute to share a few resources with you. Please remember that you can find these resources and many, many more on the PDF handout that accompanies this set of lectures. The first is an article by Christopher Headley called Galenic Humors. It appeared in an article in the Journal of the American Herbalist Guild. He is a great writer. It's really easy to understand, and I highly recommend this, especially if you're new to the study of humoral medicine. The next one here is Principles and Practice of Phytotherapy. So this is by Bones and Mill. This is a pretty dense book. I felt the need to put it here because it really just goes super in depth into phytotherapy. So if someone looking to get into medical herbalism and phytotherapy, this would be considered one of the textbooks you might study at university. Let's say you were doing your master's degree or your bachelor's degree in herbal medicine and medical herbalism. This would definitely be one of your textbooks. And it's funny because when I first got this book, I was a bit, kind of like, oh gosh, this is going to be a dull read because it is so dense, but it's quite magical. And in particular, I would encourage people, it is a resource book. So sometimes you're just looking up an herb or looking up a particular organ system. But in the introduction, there are some really wonderful, writings that really look at these awesome universal concepts. And I just found super inspiring. So that's Bones and Mill. Simon Mill and Carrie Bones, they've actually written other books as well. So you'll see a lot of books by them for that, concept of medical herbalism. I wanted to plug Kat Meyer's new book. She just wrote a book called Energetic Herbalism, and it came out maybe a month ago, 2 months ago. And I find it pretty awesome. It's got, a nice materia medica, really goes into a little bit of history of herbalism. She's got some chapters on the history of herbalism and herbal medicine. She's America based, so she definitely looks at it from that lens. And Kat Meyer, I just find to be a really wonderful teacher as well. So I think that teaching really comes through in her writing. She was trained originally as a PA, physician's assistant, so she has a good understanding of contemporary Western conventional medicine, but she also has been studying herbalism with many different teachers, with lots of energetic models for decades. And so she weaves those two things together in a really brilliant way. So highly recommended. And then finally, this in terms of, energy and humors and Galenic medicine, this is the Canon of Medicine by Avicenna. And so there's an English translation that's hosted on the North American Institute of Medical Herbalism. That's what this stands for, which is the website created by Paul Bergner. And I mentioned his name earlier. So there's actually a lot of resources on there, but if you want to, go to a source text, this is a great one to check out. And obviously it's free there for you online. And I think I show it in another later resources. I'm sorry I don't have it here, but there's a couple resources that also have really great early, and when we get to the American herbalism section, I think that I'll have them there. A couple resources for where you can find lots of other original primary texts